The internet is the greatest invention in modern history, a multifaceted tool that could provide 8 billion individuals with the ability to instantaneously communicate on a planetary scale. It is the nervous system of our civilization, with our culture intertwined with every facet of its complexity. It is both the answer and the arbiter of our problems, and how we learn to coexist with this technology will determine the future of our technologically integrated species. Our guest, Cindy Cohn, is the Executive Director for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. It is the leading nonprofit for defending digital privacy, free speech, and innovation. Cindy stands at the forefront of the fight to ensure a free and open internet, one that empowers the end user with security, with privacy, and while maximizing the capabilities of this astounding technology. She's calling for the re-decentralization of the internet to ensure that the very structure of this technology is serving the needs of the average citizen rather than the most powerful organizations on the planet. It is time to question the reality that you've always accepted when you log into the World Wide Web, and to ask yourself if this could be done better. Our governments, our cultures, our country, and our future hangs in the balance. My name is Robert Roach, and this is the Type 1 Planet podcast. Watch or listen to this episode. Please subscribe, share it with someone who might become inspired, and visit us at type1planet.net. Hello and welcome everyone to the Type 1 Planet podcast. I'm Robert Roach, and I'm today joined by our guest, Cindy Cohn, who is the Executive Director for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. It's the leading nonprofit for defending digital privacy, free speech, and innovation. Cindy, your work is all about ensuring the civil rights and personal freedoms of American citizens. It's incredible. I'm humbled that you chose to be on the show with me today, so thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So the mission of Type 1 Planet, we're trying to reimagine and hopefully spark a redesign of our civilization so we can enter into a long-term sustainable state that's in equilibrium with ourselves and our planetary environment. And we believe that the technological foundation for the future of humanity, it's being laid down right now around us. And our culture seems to spiral around the technology that's powering it, with the internet acting as almost like a nervous system for our civilization. So I want to start with the EFF. You know, in the context of building a better civilization around that nervous system, what is the mission of the Electronic Frontier Foundation? What are you trying to achieve, and why does it exist?
Well, EFF was founded in 1990, so we're kind of the OG digital rights organization. We predate the World Wide Web, and our mission is to make sure that the digital technologies support, freedom, justice, and innovation for all the people of the world. It's a small mission. But the idea is to try to build a digital world that supports people instead of one that represses people. And we've known, again, since before the World Wide Web, that technology is powerful and that technology doesn't magically make everything better, but it can help us make things better just as it can help us make things worse. And EFF was founded with the idea that having a dedicated bunch of people trying to make sure that we came down on the better side of that would be helpful. And I think, it's not the only thing that helps, but it is one of the crucial pieces of building a better world. I really love the idea of this podcast, and I think it meshes well with EFF's own podcast called How to Fix the Internet, where we're doing something similar, not so much about the whole planet, but about this small piece of the planet that is our digital technologies, and how do we envision a better world? Because we don't think you can build a better world unless you can envision it. And so I feel like this work that you're doing and the work that we're doing are really, they're all pointing at the same thing, like this, giving people a vision of what it looks like if we get it right so that we can be aiming at the right things.
The storytelling element of what you're trying to do and what I'm trying to do is so important. It's a form of marketing. You're creating a vision in people's minds of something that maybe they've never seen before, didn't. So help me imagine what your vision, what the EFF's vision of a free and open internet, what does that look like?
Well, I think that it looks like something where the technologies that you use are answered just to you. and they don't secondarily or even primarily answer to somebody else. So your phone isn't ratting you out. The websites you visit aren't reporting back to, Google or, the raft of digital surveillance technologies, digital tracking technologies that are trying to, figure out about you without you really knowing or having any control over that. The 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 systems that help determine what you see and what you do and how you're tracked are either controlled by you or much more locally than they're controlled now. Communities and having communities empowered. Every individual can't read all the terms of service that we're subjected to each day. Um, the way that our technology has developed has really gotten far out of step with how we live our lives, and I think that just bringing them back into step with how we live our lives, both individually and as communities, is really the North Star that we should be aiming at.
Hmm. Uh, I can't imagine from a legal perspective you seeing the incredible user agreements that people sign up for multiple times a day. It seems like when you download an app or what have you. I mean, that just must be shocking from a legal perspective.
Yeah, I mean, when I was in law school, I'm a lawyer by training. We had this idea that we were taught about what a contract was, right? And a contract was like, two equally powered individuals who sit down and have a meeting of the minds about how they want to go forward, and they write it down, and everybody's bound by it. But the central piece of this is that there is relative equality between the parties negotiating, and they have a shared understanding. They reach a shared understanding and agree to that going forward. And that is so far from the world that most of us live in, and the terms that are imposed upon us that are, written by a bunch of lawyers at a couple of law firms and then reused by websites and systems all across the world. Um, and that really honestly are not, they're not even, I don't know, they're so far removed from that kind of canonical vision. And that in and of itself, might not be a problem if they were really fair anyway. But they're not fair. They're one-sided, and it's increasingly difficult to get a court to recognize that there's a problem here. EFF has handled a bunch of cases involving terms of service violations, where it's, the courts are still pretending that we're in this kind of law school version of a contract when, that's not at all what's happening.
Right, right. Where they actually are pretending that people read them. You mean? Yeah,
Or should have read them, right? Like
right.
as if this is, I mean, again, we need to right size how the digital world works for individuals and for groups. I don't mean this to be, I believe in human rights. I think a human rights centered strategy is important. But I also think that communities can help solve some of the problems that individuals can't solve. Like every single individual shouldn't have to be making their own decisions about what's spam and what's not spam. We can harness the powers of community to decide those kinds of things, as long as we have the right checks and balances and safeguards. Sorry, I'm getting very abstract very quickly here.
No, I'm down to get abstract 100%. So before we got on, we were joking about having to download and use Chrome to use this program, Riverside, which is shout out to Riverside. It's great. Um, and you described it as a monoculture perhaps Google is a monoculture in the internet space, and something I've heard you mention is a term re-decentralization of the internet in your
Yes.
interviews. And when I think of Google, there's not a better word to describe centralization
Yeah.
than Google. And so what does re-decentralization look like? And who's taking steps to make this a reality?
Yeah, there's steps happening all over the place. Let's start with the which is the idea, and I think it's correct, that the internet was designed and originally used in a very decentralized way. Now, I'm not talking about at the bottom layers of the internet, where we've always had kind of some big companies that have controlled some of those kinds of things. But at a user level, there wasn't a centralized, Google or Facebook where you signed in and that was your entire experience. The internet was far you know, right now we've reached a point where we've basically got 5 tech giants that have astounding profits, and they control the experience of most of what we do. And so I am not just picking on Google here. I think there are several different companies that have basically divided up pieces of our online experience and control it. And Google with Chrome. It controls a lot of what we get to do on various websites, because even if you're not on Chrome itself, the Chromium underlying undercarriage also controls and limits a lot of what people can do. And I don't mean that just to diss it. I just think many is better than one. The problems with one are well documented in our society. We have a body of antitrust law, we have competition law, because we believe, especially in the West, that having people do competition, having companies have to compete for our attention and the services that we use, above a base level of services, that helps create a race to the top that benefits us as users. And we've lost that race to the top in so many areas right now, because there's just one dominant platform or a gatekeeper that controls what options we get to have. And by gatekeeper, I'm thinking about things like app stores,
Mm-hmm.
where at least on the Apple side. Just to be fair, I'll throw some rocks at Google. I'll throw some at Apple too. Apple, just is being required to open up their app store in Europe as a side effect of some of the laws that are coming into effect in the European Union, so that people don't have to, go on bended knee to Apple to get their apps in the App Store. We know that while Apple does some stuff that's good there, some security and other kinds of things, they also end up being beholden to, say, the Chinese government about what
Mm-hmm.
kind of apps are available to people in China, what kind of VPNs and security tools are available to people, and other kinds of limits. So having one choke point is problematic there. So in answer to your question, what's going on? There's a lot of stuff going on right now to try to re-decentralize internet infrastructures. We're recording this right now at a time when we're seeing a lot of people look beyond Twitter for a social media option. And some of the technologies in the Fediverse, like Mastodon, are decentralized technologies, so that instead of having to worry that some billionaire buys the tool that you rely on for your business and your life and starts doing, bizarre things, you have a local host for your social media. And if you don't like that local host, you can leave and go to a different one that makes the kinds of choices that align with you. Or you could even roll your own and host your own and make your own decisions about what you kind of do. That's the power of decentralization over centralization,
Mm-hmm.
um, is this ability to leave when you want to leave, take your friends, your friends list with you, and pick a place or build a place that better suits your own values. And, again, that kind of moves us from the idea of the one, and we just hope that we have, one dictator who's a benevolent dictator and will never make any decision that we disagree with, to something where we're really tossing out the dictators and claiming control ourselves. And I think that's a better world.
A really interesting and important component of the, let's say, the social media conversation is that you don't actually own anything. As, let's say, you are a contributor who builds a massive audience on the app, let's say on TikTok or on Twitter, and you have
Mhm.
millions of followers. You could get banned tomorrow, or the app could get shut down by the government tomorrow, or something along those lines, and then you don't have ownership to access those people anymore. You never
That's
actually
right.
had any assets. And are you aware of how Mastodon works or anything like that that gives you that sort of access, where you have an actual ownership, an email address or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, ownership might not be the right term for some of this, but you're right that you have control. So
Mm,
and that's because there's ways in which ownership means kind of leads you towards a a thing that's really more physical than the way things work in the digital world. But I think that you're absolutely right that the activity pub, which is the underlying infrastructure that Mastodon is built on, and a lot of other things in the Fediverse are built on, um, is built from the code level to let you take your followers list when you go someplace else. So when you shift, as I said, shift places, you don't have to start over. Excuse me. One of the side effects of being in my closet is it's a little musty in here.
It's all good.
So one of the great things about the way that ActivityPub works, and ActivityPub is the underlying technology that Mastodon and other parts of the Fediverse are built on, is that it does let you leave with your list of followers and connections and go someplace else. That's one of I think the things that is most exciting about a more decentralized this more decentralized infrastructure. Um, and it does leave you a little less at the whims of whoever is hosting your speech, and I think that's really important. People are building their lives and their livelihoods on these networks, and we need to honor those and not pretend like they're just things that people can come and go with. Another idea that EFF has championed is this idea that we call adversarial interoperability or competitive compatibility, and this is another one of these kind of words where the internet, the early internet infrastructures were built such that you could interoperate with a service without having to be all the way on it or all the way off it. Right. So our friend Mike Masnick uses a term called, platform protocols, not platforms. Right. Where the platform mentality is really this Roach Motel idea that you sign on to a platform and everything you do is controlled by them. And then you can't really leave. Certainly not with the things that you've built there. Protocols are ways that systems, and the kind of canonical idea of a protocol is email, right? So it sounds technical, but all of us use a decentralized protocol right now. That's how email works. So it doesn't matter who your ISP is. If you're using email, you can email with somebody else on any other ISP, and it's seamless and it's not degraded because they don't like your system, because it uses a platform, it uses a protocol to help you connect, and it's not platform based. So adversarial interoperability or competitive compatibility is this idea that we push for the development of tools that we use that let you interoperate with them without having to be basically locked in to their systems. And again, this is something that I think the early internet was built in, and that we have now fenced in in this platform mentality. In a way, we need to break out of those fences.
It's so interesting that we keep referring back to the early internet as something that was working or something that was idyllic in some way. What about our system caused the changes that were in the issues that we're experiencing now? Is it the capitalist system? Is it lack of governance? What happened?
Well, I think somebody who's a actual historian will probably do a better job of this than me. But the things that I've seen in the 22 years that I've been doing this work is this, in some ways, this venture capital winner take all model that really encouraged companies to try to grow hugely, at the same time that we were really degrading um, antitrust and competition laws in the United States and even around the world. I think that these two things kind of happened together in a way that reinforced each other and made it easier and easier to build, and more profitable, and pressure from the money side to build these kinds of platforms with big fences that didn't let people leave. And then our tools like antitrust and competition law, and some of the other laws that EFF fights a lot became useful anti-competitive tools. So things like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, terms of service enforcement, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, Section 1201. These are all laws that help protect people who build fences, and really don't recognize the needs of a truly competitive digital space for things like adversarial
Mm,
interoperability or reverse engineering or security testing.
mm,
So I think that there's probably multiple factors that led to this, but the two that I see are the increasing use of these laws that may not have been written to be anti-competitive, but that lend themselves to be anti-competitive, the reduction in antitrust enforcement and competitive enforcement laws, and then this kind of venture capital model that really encouraged people who are building businesses to build these kind of closed platforms, these walled gardens where you lock people in. I think all of these things happened at the same time for a bunch of reasons, but they've resulted in this world. And the good news about that is those are all things that are reversible. There are some technical arguments that centralized systems are better for some things. And I think those arguments are important and we need to listen to them sometimes, but I think they get overplayed. And we need to
mm,
look at the difference between, Facebook's claiming that, they had to lock everybody into Facebook because that's the only way they could stop another Cambridge Analytica from happening, right? This is one of these arguments that gets made about why, these closed systems are necessary. And of course, there's a pretty easy answer to that is you were plenty closed and you let Cambridge Analytica access everybody's data anyway. Putting you in charge of who gets to interoperate with our data didn't actually work out in that system. So, and that we need to separate out the reasonable pieces of that argument from the convenient pieces of that argument. And if we had a baseline privacy law, instead of leaving all of privacy protection or unprotection to these big centralized platforms, we we could have the best of both worlds, right? We could have
mhm,
a system in which everybody is obligated to protect your privacy and to not have an exploitative business model because that's the floor the law sets. And then those untangling privacy problems and security problems from the questions of platformization, that takes some thinking, but it's not impossible and we can do it.
mm. Yeah, every time I think about closed systems and I think about Apple and their whole closed system, but then we have issues like the Pegasus surveillance program,
Yep.
out of I think Israel, and
Yeah.
that's a total disaster in terms of personal privacy, and
Yep.
it's being sold to governments and to organizations and to individuals, and it's an insane notion. So let's pivot then fully into governance and surveillance.
Yeah.
Uh, uh, you know, when commenting on how governments can strike a balance between privacy and protection for their citizens, you said something along the lines of that we should give government the tools they need, not all that they want, without infringing on people's basic rights. So, and that I think what you said, we need to have human rights based approach to governance of the internet. So, what does a human rights based approach look like, and what are these tools that we could provide to our governments?
Well, our government has a tremendous number of tools right now. My friend Peter Swire called this a golden age of government surveillance, right? They have so many tools right now that they did not have before the rise of the internet. So let's start from the idea that it's not about what we give them; it might be more about what we take away,
Hmm.
and what we limit. Because right now it's way out of balance, right? An individual has absolutely no ability, not absolutely, but has to go to tremendous lengths to have the simple human right of it being able to have a private conversation in the digital world. The ability to have a private conversation using digital tools is a fundamental human right. And so we don't have systems that are built around protecting that right now. In fact, we have almost just the opposite, right? Between the business model issues and the governmental issues and where they overlap with each other. You can be someone who installs all the technologies and uses them perfectly and has a private conversation online, but there's a way in which we built a system where extremely sophisticated criminals get privacy and the rest of us don't. Right. That's not the right way that we should be. So let's think about what are the kinds of things we need. Well, I think we need end-to-end encryption for almost, for a huge amount of the things that we do. Our everyday conversation needs to be end-to-end encrypted, and it needs to not be, the government's come up with so many euphemisms: backdoor, side door, security keys, whatever, that the ability to have a private conversation ought to be paramount and central and recognized as a human right. And then we build systems to support that. Um, does that mean the government will never have access to our end-to-end encrypted things? No, of course not. The main thing the government does is they flip people, right? They get somebody on one end or the other to give them access to the conversations. Often, this is how it works in prosecutions. You find somebody and you get them to flip and give you access. It'll always be the case that the other end of your conversation, if you're actually having a real conversation with someone, can turn that conversation over to law enforcement. So that's a tremendous tool. Law enforcement has always had it, and doing end-to-end encryption won't stop that. And frankly, it's the central way that cases get developed. There's a lot of fetishization in law enforcement with this idea that they can secretly, just monitor everything and then figure out where a crime is going on without actually having to do any, gumshoe legal work. I don't think that that's really necessary. It's a huge problem for people around the world because we know that if you compromise the security of communications for a good guy, bad guys are going to be able to use it too, right? We've never been able to build, think about that. And this is, sometimes real world metaphors are not great, but I think this is an area about security where a real world metaphor is kind of great, which is, you know, if the police showed up at your house and said, we think that there's a lot of crime going on, and so we want you to leave the back door of your house open just in case you're a criminal, so we can come in and check and make sure that you're not a criminal, or that criminals aren't using your house. Most of us would be like, are you kidding? That's a horrible security idea. You're going to make me vulnerable to all sorts of bad guys. And how do I even know that just you are going to use this backdoor once it exists? Isn't it available to anybody who wants to use it? The answer in a physical house would be obvious, and law enforcement would never ask us to do that. But that's essentially what they're arguing to do to our digital communications, whether it's scanning our devices or any other kinds of systems that we use. They're trying to say, well, build a backdoor and only the good guys will use it, and they'll only use it under specific circumstances. And that's it's not realistic. It's not really true in our experience. And you've talked about Pegasus as well, which is state-sponsored malware that basically uses the same compromise tools that law enforcement uses. It's important that we protect the human right to have a private conversation online, and that we don't get sidetracked by some of these claims by law enforcement or national security folks that they need, mass access to our communications, or even targeted access to our communications that compromises the security of our devices and tools.
Hmm. Well, let's talk about those human rights, at least in the United States. I did my absolute best to read your article from the Yale Law Journal, "Protecting the Fourth Amendment in the Information Age: A Response to Robert Litt," and it
Yeah.
was really interesting. Highly
Oh
recommend
my
everyone go
goodness.
Google that. And you referred to a reasonable expectation of privacy test being currently employed by the Fourth Amendment, and that's a poor test for the digital age.
Yep.
And could you explain, what are our current rights to digital privacy through the Constitution? And what does a better legal test look like in the digital age?
Yeah, I think that it's important to remember that the Fourth Amendment is kind of the outer boundary of our privacy. There are also privacy laws as well. So it's important not to to just recognize that we've got several layers of privacy protection, but they're all not great right now. But when you get to the Fourth Amendment, when does the government get access to your information? This reasonable expectation of privacy test is problematic on a couple of levels. First, it's individually subjective, right? When do you have a reasonable expectation of privacy in what you do? And the problem with that is it's turning out that the courts are saying that if somebody tells you that you don't have privacy in using a system, then you can't have a reasonable expectation of privacy anymore. So the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply. And that's pretty problematic because it creates just this downward ratchet. When you tell somebody that they don't have any privacy, then they don't have any privacy anymore because they can't reasonably expect it if the law or the government or the system they're using tells them they don't. So it means like if you've got a terms of service that says, we're going to turn your information over to law enforcement whenever we feel like it, you no longer have a reasonable expectation of privacy, and the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply anymore. And what that means is the government doesn't have to go to a judge and get a warrant and justify that they need to have access to your communication. So it opens us up to mass surveillance and it also reduces the need for the government to go in to a judge and make a showing that they need that they have individualized suspicion against you and a reason to go in and get access to your communication. So I think this test, while at the time that it was adopted, it might have made some sense. It's kind of been outstripped by the way that these systems are being built and deployed. And it's time to really think about the human right to privacy as something that isn't easily waivable by you and me. It's not something that we easily give away or click away or any of those things. It's actually a human right at the level where it's a pretty high bar to say that it's gone away. And to me, the high bar is have they done an individualized or group level analysis that says that you might be engaging in a crime, and then that's the time, something like a warrant test, when law enforcement can begin to take a look at what you're doing.
We haven't touched we have peripherally, but we haven't touched very specifically on personal data and that as a personal private property, and property is insured by the Constitution. And in the same article on in your response to Robert Litt, you talked about the human eyes theory around the Fourth Amendment. And I don't know if you recall this from the article, but can you explain this concept? The current process when our personal data is seized by the government, there's
Yes.
a portion of it that's automated and then the rest is performed by human beings. How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, this is an argument that we're having with the government. And the government argues that your privacy isn't violated when a machine learning algorithm, or any kind of machine system looks at the content of your communications or the metadata, who you talk to, how often, when, and where you are. That's the metadata. That when a machine scans that and looks for issues that might make what you're doing suspicious to the government, that doesn't count for purposes of the Fourth Amendment. The only thing that counts for purposes of the Fourth Amendment is when human eyes look at what you're saying. And never looks at the metadata. The metadata is completely free of the Fourth Amendment. And the only thing that matters for purposes of the Fourth Amendment is when an actual human being reads your email or your other activities, your social media, or anything that's private. And what does that mean? Well, that means that most of us do all along is not protected by the Fourth Amendment at all. The fact that I talk to my doctor several times a day during a situation in which I'm ill or a member of my household is ill, is completely unprotected by the Fourth Amendment. Uh, Even though it can tell you a lot about me, my location being tracked all the time, or for a significant amount of time, is not protected by the Fourth Amendment. The only thing that counts for purposes of the Fourth Amendment is the much more narrow category of the actual content of my communications. And I think that's very, very dangerous for us. And it's also not what people think. If you ask people what they think, I mean, again, I'm not a fan of the reasonable expectation of privacy test, but most Americans think that they have far more privacy in the constitutional sense than they do. And aligning what people expect from these technologies with how the law actually works ought to be a goal in our society. And to me, that goal ought to be a race to the top, not a race to the bottom. Um, so I think that this humanized theory is a governmental argument that tries to narrow what matters for the Constitution to this very narrow sliver of our privacy. And what I do in this piece and what EFF has done in a lot of our cases, especially our national security cases, is try to push back on that idea, and really capture the full scope of our privacy in what the Constitution protects, not just this little narrow sliver.
Hmm. Well, a big part of the Type 1 Planet project is finding a way to make finding a way to have these documents and these governmental systems to be responsive and plastic to the realities of a modern age.
Yes.
And is it possible to have our constitution evolve with the existence of the internet? Is it possible for the way that our government uh, operates to evolve with the existence of digital technology and the internet? um,
Sure. It's
uh,
absolutely possible. I would say that right now there is a strain of judicial, um, there's really no better word, judicial activism, conservative judicial activism. It's very prominent in our Supreme Court right now and a lot of our lower courts, that has this idea that nothing should change, that our Constitution was written at a particular point in time, and anything that wasn't envisioned by some frankly not very good history of those times shouldn't be protected by our Constitution. And the problem with that is the one that you've articulated. Our society moves forward and people have rights. Like this, we didn't encase this in amber, right? And that's not the way to think about our rights. The right way to think about our rights is what matters for privacy today, given the world that we live in, what matters for free speech today, given the world that we live in, what matters for all the rights that are in the Bill of Rights today, given how people are living. And that's a different inquiry than the one that sadly is being embraced by a lot of members of the judicial system right now. And I think that one of the things that people who are thinking about how to build a better world need to think about is, how do we interrogate this idea that our rights are locked in the past and are limited by past technologies? Um, because that's inherent, right? There was no internet at when the Bill of Rights was passed, and it can't be the case that the Bill of Rights is just irrelevant to our our digital world, because there was no
right.
digital world when they passed the Bill of Rights. Honestly, even the originalists don't think this. Instead, they kind of pick and choose. And I think that we need to um, think hard about what the original teachings of the Constitution are, but not be locked in to the technologies that existed at that time, or
Mhm.
the people who were allowed to vote at that time, or any of the other kind of cultural artifacts of that time. I don't think that's what a rights analysis ought to do.
Hmm. Well, so many people who couldn't vote back then can vote today, and that was the product of voting and free and fair elections, which is what I would hope to just quickly pivot into.
Sure.
It's turning into a strong sub focus on our show. Elections, electing technology. How do we shore up the democratic method to be more resilient in a technological age? I've had an amazing conversation with Bruce Schneier. We
He's the
extensively
best.
explored, he's awesome. We explored the merits of the voter verified paper ballot
Yep.
election method. So check out that episode. And then I also got to talk to Aaron Hamlin. I don't know if you're aware of who he is. He's the executive director for the Center of Election Science. And
Oh,
he gave us a whole rundown on this amazing method called approval voting. So that's a whole different. So basically, it's a way to actually conduct the election. It's interesting. So we're kind of starting to dive into this. Um, Tell us about your work in litigation strategy for electronic voting machines. what is the EFF currently focusing on in terms of election security?
Yeah, EFF got involved pretty early on, and when we were seeing these early election electronic voting machines that were completely insecure, that were Microsoft Access databases and things that everybody in the digital world knew we would no longer use because they're very secure, were getting rolled out into these election systems, and frankly with the pretense that they were secure when everyone knew that they weren't. We helped uh, create and pass some of the laws that required the voter verified paper trail VVPATs, and move to some of these systems that are more like electronic scanners, that where you fill it out on paper and then you scan it in, and the machines do what the machines do pretty well, which is count things, and but we still had the paper backup to check, and then from there, some of the scientists who were thinking hard about election technology developed this idea called risk limiting audits. And this is using, old school audit strategies to um, count just a subset of the votes, but a selected, a representative subset of the votes to see whether the voting counting was working correctly or whether there was
Mm.
a problem with it. And so EFF has championed those. We do a little less of this work now. There is now a very robust election protections, and movement that understands how this technology works and is working for it. I think the areas where we tend to get involved are, first of all, there is often, and actually right now, a very big push to try to do internet voting. Some of it's founded is pushed by a technologist named Bradley Tusk, and trying to push internet voting. And the internet is not secure enough for us to vote on. I mean, anybody who's ever had their data stolen, which is all of us, right, out of these massive databases and stuff, should understand that the internet is nowhere near secure enough to let us vote on it. And I certainly would be very supportive of a world in which we had true end-to-end encryption and extremely secure processes so that we could vote on the internet, but we can't right now. And we're not even close. So EFF weighs in a lot on that because it's really at heart a digital security question that's fairly, and frankly, it's easy to answer, but we keep having to say it over and over again.
Hmm.
But anybody who knows or cares about a good digital future should say no to internet voting right now, and should say it very loudly and clearly. Unfortunately, the efforts by Mr. Tusk and his colleagues have kind of snookered some state legislatures into considering these kinds of things in other systems,
Mm.
and we're constantly having to battle back on that. We also
Have
are
you ever
working
gotten to
on.
speak with him? Have you ever gotten to
No,
speak with
I would
Bradley
love it.
Tusk?
I'd
You would?
really
All right.
welcome the conversation.
I'm gonna
Yeah,
hit him up.
and I don't mean to make it so personal. There's a lot of people who dream that we could have internet voting, but this was something that Yang, the um,
Andrew Yang.
Andrew Yang, thought was a good idea too. I mean, I think people who love technology but haven't thought a lot about security often think this is a really good idea, and it's really not.
Mm.
Um, I think that EFF also has been involved in some of the litigation around voting systems. One of the funny things that's happened in our current world is that legitimate security concerns around electronic voting systems have been co-opted by people who are trying to sow fear around our elections and basically undermine our electoral system. So it puts a lot of security people in a funny position because some of our critiques are really being used as a way to try to undermine confidence in the system, really, rather than as a way to try to make the systems better. And so trying to raise these concerns in a way that will make sure that they're taken seriously and not just used as fodder for some other agenda is the tricky moment that we're in right now.
It was an interesting part of my conversation with Bruce. He said that internet voting is exactly what you said. But he said internet voting could totally be possible if everyone gave up the right for a secret ballot,
Mhm.
where you could, everyone's vote could be assigned to their name.
Yep,
Then great. You can verify them the same way that you would verify a person to open a bank account.
correct.
Um, And that's a societal value question. That's a conversation that as a country we could have, if we wanted to make that step. But the way that the system exists now, it's not possible to work.
That's correct. And I would argue strongly, like, that's not a good step. I think that's an interesting hypothetical to get people think about the problem. But the secret ballot's really important. It's not,
Right.
it's actually a fundamental. I think that I would put that in a pretty close fundamental value, right? Because people get coerced into voting a particular way. This is a historical problem. We created the secret ballot to solve a problem, and that problem would exist again if we got rid of the secret ballot. People getting harassed for their votes, people getting coerced for their votes. This was an extremely difficult problem in often in labor context, where your employer would tell people how they had to vote. Which was generally on the employer's side rather than standing up for the rights of employees. But people felt like they'd lose their job if they didn't vote the way the boss told them to. That's just one example. And there's certainly lots of examples in the context of gender where husbands are telling their wives how to vote. And especially in the context of suffrage, right? When women were really trying to fight, to have the vote and to have basic rights. So anyway, I think that while it's important, it's a useful hypothesis to think about what the world would look like if we didn't have a secret ballot anymore. I think that we shouldn't confuse that with an actual good policy choice. It's a horrible policy choice. And so that's why we need to not vote on the internet. And that's why we need to increase the security of our digital things, not reduce it.
Well, this episode, Cindy, will be such an interesting node in the evolution of the Type 1 planet model. We've talked about free and fair internet. How do we ensure it through its future through governance? How do we ensure the future of that governance and that governmental body through elections? I think they're all essential stages in creating a civilization that works. So I'd like to ask you, Bradley Tusk is a great example. Who would you like to sit down with at a table to collaborate with or debate with on these topics? Is there other people who come to mind? Who should I bring into the conversation, either to hear a different perspective or to dive deeper into some of these concepts?
I mean, one of the problems that I've been thinking about a lot these days is how to do decentralization in a way that protects privacy. And this is a situation in which there are so that one of the people who argues that you need to have centralization in order to really protect privacy is Moxie Marlinspike, who of the Signal Network. And Moxie's a really thoughtful person. And he's reached a conclusion that I really don't like, and I'd love to interrogate, like, why, how do we think about how to solve the problems of centralization, and the problems of security. Let me see if I can say this right. How do we solve the problems of security in a decentralized, while still pushing for the benefits of a decentralized world? He's not the only one who thinks this way. There are quite a few other people, but I would love to, frankly, just try to figure that out. I think for the internet voting things, it'd be interesting to talk to Mr. Tusk. I'm not sure I would convince him of things. I mean, I think the people I'm more interested in are the people who are truly wrestling with the issues right now and are open to thinking about a different way forward. I think there are, there are people right now who are wrestling with, how do we create more competition online? How do we do decentralization in a way that is consistent with our other values? Privacy is only one of them, that it would be very interesting to sit down and talk to. I'm not sure. I mean, some of this will be like nuts and bolts and things that might not be great for a podcast. I have to be honest. Some of the nuts and bolts of how you fix things are boring radio and boring podcasts, but they're crucial. They're crucial.
This show is actually built on nuts and bolts, funnily enough,
Nice.
because while the listener, the general listener is an important aspect of it, maybe the important aspect. The other potential important aspect is giving an avenue where someone can sit down in a short period of time and learn the language of someone who maybe has a similar mission but a different approach. And this has been big for breaking down silos in the scientific community, which we're working hard on right now, especially in terms of handling microplastics in water. There's all these different scientists who have incredible approaches, but they're all different. They don't know each other's language. So sitting down and explaining it to my brain apparently has helped a lot with building those bridges of communication. So
that's great.
I'm
That's
down for the nuts
great.
and bolts, and please hit me up if any other people jump into mind. I'll
Yeah,
follow up with you
I
for
will
sure.
keep thinking about it. I do think that I think we have a similar thing going on in the digital world right now. There's a set of people who are thinking about how to increase competition and reinvigorate antitrust laws. There are people who are thinking about how we increase security. There are people who are thinking about decentralization for a range of reasons, and they do tend to be a little siloed. And one of the fulcrums that EFF finds itself in is this interesting place with decentralization and security. Because we have long defended and supported the security research community that does independent security research, but we also really recognize the need to get away from the big five tech tech world, and that this push towards centralization is being security is being used as one of the arguments that the tech giants make for why they can't support competition. So we're beginning to see, where the European Union passed a law that says that messaging systems have to be interoperable. I wouldn't have picked secure messaging as the place to start because the security problems are pretty acute there. But we're going to live through it, and we're going to see how it goes. And it's going to be important to think creatively about how to make both of these, make sure that we're not compromising one of these values for the other.
Well, Cindy, before we wrap up, please send everyone who's listening to this or watching this to what are the best links to learn more about you, learn more about EFF, and tell us just a little bit about the How to Fix the Internet podcast. I'd love to hear just a sentence.
Sure. Yeah. Well, EFF.org is your place to go for all things EFF, including me. And we're on all the social medias, including the decentralized ones. We're on Mastodon as well as on Twitter and Facebook and elsewhere. It's pretty easy to find our stuff. Our blog is very active. We are a 100-person organization. We're working on lots of issues all the time, and so whatever whatever piece of of our work is interesting, you'll find lots of active stuff going on there. The podcast is called How to Fix the Internet. It's me and our digital strategy. Excuse me. It's How to Fix the Internet. It's me and our senior digital strategist, Jason Kelly. And we pick one person who each episode and try to talk about what the world looks like if we start to get it right. And we go from highly technical security types to science fiction writers to artists. I think we're going to have to harness all of society if we're going to envision a better world. And so we go deep with somebody who's got a piece of this story for each episode. And EFF kind of gets called the 911 of the internet, right? We warn about all the things that could go wrong a lot, and we rush in when things go wrong a lot. And the idea of the podcast is to step away from that kind of emergency rushing in framing, and instead really try to turn forward and think about what the world looks like if we get it right.
I love that. Well, let's get it right, Cindy. I'm so thankful for this conversation and looking forward to the future conversations we get to have. Thank you for coming on.
Terrific. Thank you. I'd love to come back.
Awesome.